today despite the heavy traffic. So first of all, when I came in, I just had a look around and I could see a lot of familiar faces and some of the new faces. So just in case if you are here for the first time, welcome everyone, and all people who regularly come as well, you are also welcome, and people who are watching online, thank you for joining us. Understandably, we are missing quite a number of people today because some are out of town and some are participating in marathons. So, well, God be with them all. And recently we have been looking into 1 Corinthians. So today Mark is going to talk about Paul's point of view on singleness and marriage. So looking forward to that. And I just want to share one thought that I usually think whenever I come to church, which is, ours is very international church, and when you see we people are coming from different backgrounds, different cultures, but what unites us is our belief in God. So He's the base for all of us gathering here. So there are so many beautiful verses mentioned in the Bible about that, but one verse that I would like to read, well, Mark has talked about this a few sermons ago, but I want to read one more verse. Save us, O Lord, our God, and gather us from the nations, that we may give thanks to your holy name and glory in your praise. So all glory be to Him. And with that note, I would like to call upon the band on the stage to sing songs, and we will also join them.
Hello.
Stand again.
God is greater, our God is stronger, but you are higher than any other. Our God is healer, also in power of God. Our God is greater, our God is stronger, but you are higher than any other. Our God is healer, also in power of God. Our God. Surround me with the song of deliverance from my enemies, till all my fears are gone. No longer a slave to fear, I am a child of God. I'm no longer a slave to fear. I am a child of God. From my mother's womb, you have chosen me. Love has called my name. I've been born into your family. Your blood flows through my veins. I'm no longer a slave to fear. I am a child of God. I'm no longer a slave to fear. I am a child of God. Oh, 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 oh. You split the sea so I could walk right through it. My fears are drowned in perfect love. oceans rise, my soul will rest in your embrace. For I am yours, and you are mine. Your grace abounds in deepest waters. Your sovereign hand will be my guide. Your feet will fail when fear surrounds me. You never fail, and you won't start now. So I will call upon your name and keep my eyes above the waves. When oceans rise, my soul will rest in your embrace. For I am yours, and you are mine. Spirit, lead me where my trust is without borders. When you walk upon the waters, wherever you would call me. Take me deeper than my feet could ever wander, and my faith will be made stronger in the presence of my Savior. Spirit, lead me where my treasures without border. When you walk upon the waters, wherever you will call me. Take me deeper than my feet could ever wander, and my faith will be made stronger in the presence of my Savior. Spirit, lead me where my trust is without borders. Let me walk upon the waters, wherever you will call me. Take me deeper than my feet could ever wander, and my faith will be made stronger in the presence of my Savior. Call upon your name and keep my eyes above the waves. When oceans rise, my soul will rest in your embrace. For I am yours, you are mine.
Thanks, guys, and thanks for being here. Like Titus said, a lot of our people are involved in Riga Marathon, and that's okay. In fact, that will become part of the points of the sermon. And then some people are traveling, especially Dulon and Kelvin are gone, and they're the ones who often put stuff on the table. So the table is a little more bare than most Sundays, but there is coffee and tea, so you can follow the example of those who are already filling their cup. So if you need to fill up your cup, feel free to do that. But thank you for being here this morning. Before we turn to the Word, let's remember to pray for one another. We should pray for those in our body who are running. I'm not sure who all are. Aaron is running, and my wife Basma is running, and I think there's a few others that are running. Probably not the whole marathon. I think most of them are doing 10K, which is probably a smart move. But we can pray for them. Also, it's end of the school term, and so there are exams coming up for maybe many of you, and there are several of you who are working on your bachelor's or master's paper, which is pretty significant. And so we need to pray, especially for those of you who are facing kind of end of the term, extra pressure. And then I know some of you are sticking around this summer, but then some of you will be traveling back home over the summer. So I know that, travel can cause some stress and lots of expense. So we should pray for one another. So let's do that. Let's just take a moment to pray for each other. Feel free if you want to pray out loud. If one of you will express your prayers for those who are running for safety, and that while they are running, they can be salt and light. We need to continue to pray for Ashish and Daya as they're making a transition to where God is calling them next. And then, of course, for students who are finishing up the term. So if you would like to pray out loud about one of those, or maybe something that we don't know about that you know about, you can pray out loud, and then we can join you in that prayer. But let's just spend a few minutes praying for one another before we turn to the Word. Now, Lord, I pray that in the next few minutes that you would help each one of us to keep focused on the message that you have for us. And I do pray that in the midst of the words that I use, that your word will actually prevail, and we will all understand the truth better and align our lives more closely with the lives that you have for us. So, Lord, thank you that we can be here. Thank you that we can sing, and that can free our minds and hearts. Thank you for the words you've given us. Thank you for a community that we have. Thank you for these good gifts, and we are grateful for them. Amen. In a moment, Titus. So we are in the middle of our 1 Corinthians series. We started that in January. We are only in chapter 7. We did spend several weeks in chapter 15. I said at the beginning that, we're going to spend a good bit of time in this series. And so we Today we're going to be looking at part of chapter 7. We already started that chapter 2 weeks ago. There'll probably be 2 more Sundays just in that chapter. Then we'll probably go to the next big section of 1 Corinthians, chapters 8 to 10, and that will take us through June. And then more than likely for the rest of the summer, we'll take a slight break from 1 Corinthians, and then we'll pick that up again in September. That's partially because I think many of you will be gone parts of the summer, and I kind of don't want you to miss the 1 Corinthians series, because I think when we get everything that Paul says, it should be transforming. And so we'll kind of pick that up in September. And that will let you all be here when we get to more of the controversial parts of 1 Corinthians. So I don't want you to miss the controversy when we get to there. But this morning we're especially looking at the first 16 verses of 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And Titus is going to come and read that for us.
First Corinthians chapter 7, verses 1 to 16. Marriage. Now for the matters you wrote about, it is good for a man not to marry, but since there is so much immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. The husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife's body does not belong to her alone, but also to her husband. In the same way, the husband's body does not belong to him alone, but also to his wife. Do not deprive each other except by mutual consent and for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer, then come together again so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. I say this as concession, not as a command. I wish that all men were as I am, but each man has his own gift from God. One has this gift, another has that. Now to the unmarried and the widows. I say, it is good for them to stay unmarried as I am, but if they cannot control themselves, they should marry. For it is better to marry than to burn with passion. To the married I give this command, not I but the Lord. A wife must not separate from her husband, but if she does, she must remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband, and a husband must not divorce his wife. To the rest I say, I, not the Lord. If any brother has a wife who is not a believer and she is willing to live with him, he must not divorce her. And if a woman has a husband who is not a believer and he is willing to live with her, she must not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband has been sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife has been sanctified through her believing husband. Otherwise your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. But if the believer leaves, let him do so. A believing man or woman is not bound in such circumstances. God has called us to live in peace. How do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband, or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife?
That focuses a little bit more on marriage. Next Sunday, we'll look a little bit more in detail in specific things that Paul says about singleness, but his ideas kind of weave together. So I hope you can come back next week and get the next part, or if you can't come back next week, at least you can find it on YouTube and kind of get the big picture. It would really be nice to have a 2 or 3 hour lecture on this chapter, but none of you want to spend a sunny day in this room for 2 or 3 hours. So we're breaking it up over several Sundays. But what we did last week is we looked at the middle section of this chapter, because the pattern that Paul uses is an ABA pattern, and he uses it other places. And in the 2A sections of chapter 7, he directly answers their questions about marriage and singleness. But in the central section, he's giving a central principle that applies to their question, but also applies to a lot of other areas of life. And so even if, some of what I say today about marriage and singleness you're not interested in, or you think it doesn't apply to you, as a matter of fact, there's a lot that Paul says here applies to a lot of different kinds of decisions that we make. And last week we looked at that central section where the main idea that Paul repeats 3 times in those verses is, whatever situation you were in when God called you, remain in that situation. That's kind of the default setting. There might be exceptions. Okay, but your life circumstances, Paul used the examples of circumcision or uncircumcision. That is, whatever your ethnic background is, when God called you with that in mind, and you shouldn't try to escape that. Then Paul talks about whether you're a slave or free, remain in that situation. Whatever your socioeconomic situation is, don't think that just because you have become a Christian, there's some reason you've got to get out of that situation. Okay, whatever situation you were in when God called you, consider remaining there. And Paul has a reason for that. And I argued last time that this is the general principle that Paul is operating with. Paul is other-focused. That is, he's focused on other people. You don't make this decision just mainly in reference to yourself, what is more convenient for you, but you make these decisions based on what is the effect of your life on others, always thinking about others, not just like even our own relationship with God, but our relationship with other people, our effect in the world horizontally. Okay? And so Paul is saying here, remain in your natural context, within your already existing network of contacts. Okay? Because that is your natural place for mission, to be salt and light in the world. Okay? Whatever your natural setting is, you are placed better than anyone else to make a difference in that world. Okay? So consider remaining there rather than escaping from that world. Maybe God wants you to remain in that world because you are God's person in that world. Okay? And me entering into your world is going to be a lot less effective. Who's this strange, old preacher guy coming here? People are going to listen to you in your world more than they're going to listen to me trying to enter your world. Okay? And so Paul is thinking missionally, and this is his general principle. Okay? But that principle is going to apply to their questions about marriage and singleness. But once again, it's going to apply to a lot of different kinds of decisions we're going to make. And so for the next few minutes, I want to kind of just walk through these first 16 verses, section by section, and just sort of try to explain what Paul is doing there, because he says some weird things, maybe not weird, but unexpected things. And so I want us to be clear what Paul is trying to do, and then we'll kind of take a step back and sort of get some general ideas that I think will really help us to sort out our lives. So he starts out, now concerning the things you wrote about. Like I said, they've written him a letter about marriage and singleness, and Paul is simply with these words saying, okay, now that I've talked about these other big issues in the first 6 chapters, now I'm going to start to answer your questions. Then Paul says it is good for a man not to touch a woman. And those, I put those words in quotation marks because probably this is what they have written, that there's a group in the Corinthian church who are arguing it's good for a man not to touch a woman. It's better for a man not to have sexual relations. Okay? And so there are some in the church who have that belief. And in a moment we'll talk about, why they have that belief, where it's coming from. But probably, that the core idea they've actually gotten from Paul. Okay, so if they are saying it's good for a man not to touch a woman, they think that Paul will agree with them. Okay, because he has probably said something like that. However, as we've already seen several times, the Corinthian church has taken something that Paul has said out of context, and they've missed why Paul said it, and they've maybe exalted this into this big life principle, and so they're applying it in ways that Paul did not intend, even if the core idea came from Paul. Okay, so we want to kind of figure out what it is that some Corinthians are thinking that has led them to think that, marriage and sex is no longer part of their Christian life. Now that they are Christians, that's a thing of the past. So Paul says, but, maybe there's some truth in what you say. Okay, if they got that idea from Paul, then Paul is kind of saying, okay, I get you, okay, but there's a bigger picture. So Paul says, but, on the other hand, because of immoralities, if you remember when we looked at chapter 6, Paul was talking about, immoral behavior, sexual behavior on the part of some Corinthians. Some Corinthian men are visiting the prostitutes, which is a weird thing for Christians to do. Okay, and Paul certainly says, stop that. Okay, but, why are they even doing that? What's going on? So Paul says, but the reality is you're living in the city of Corinth, which has a very blossoming sex industry. You're surrounded by sexual temptation, and therefore you might need to think differently. Maybe that principle that you've misapplied, you need to kind of pull it in a little bit. Okay, because the way you're applying that principle is not going to help you. So Paul says, because there's so much sexual temptation, it might be better for each man to have his own wife and each woman to have her own husband. So one thing to keep in mind when you read 1 Corinthians chapter 7, this is not everything that Paul has to say about marriage. Okay? He's answering a specific question. Okay, there's a lot more to marriage than getting married as a way to deal with sexual temptation. Okay, there's much more to marriage that Paul doesn't talk about in chapter 7 because he's just answering a question. But here he's saying one reason why it might be better to be married and remain married is because it can be a help against sexual temptation. Okay, so each man is to have his own wife, each woman to have her own husband. The husband must fulfill his duty to his wife. That is, the husband must fulfill his sexual duty to his wife. Likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Now, so far, most of what Paul is saying would have been acceptable in general Roman and Greek society. Yes, of course, the husband has authority over his wife's body. We all know that. It's a very patriarchal society. Okay, and so Paul says, yeah, that's true. But the next thing that Paul says is one of the most amazingly countercultural things that you can find in the New Testament. Paul says, likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. That's just, no one was saying that back in Paul's time. Paul was 2,000 years ahead of his time when he wrote those words. That in fact in marriage there's mutuality and there's equality. It's not just mainly about what the husband needs. The wife's needs are equal with the husband's needs. And yeah, the wife needs to think about the husband's needs, but the husband better think about the wife's needs, because There's obligations that he has to her, not just she to him. Okay? That's an amazing thing that Paul is saying here. But basically he's saying, if you were married when God called you, when you became a Christian, remain married and continue to have normal sexual relationships within your marriage. That's the norm. Now, why is he saying this, or rather, why are some Corinthians thinking that's not the case any longer? And if you recall this picture that I've used, and I used this when we began to introduce 1 Corinthians and what's going on in Corinth, and one of the things this illustrates is that we live in these two worlds at once. We are citizens of heaven, and we are anticipating a new body and a new heavens and a new earth, but at the same time, we are also living on this earth in this present age, in these present bodies that we were born in. Okay? And we've got to live in both of those worlds at once. Okay, the Corinthian problem is that some of them are becoming super spiritual. And they think that now that we're Christians, this reality no longer has no bearing on any decision that we make. We are now so much in this heavenly realm that maybe marriage and sex are things of the past. Marriage and sex are for this, and since this is more or less ending, therefore marriage and sex is already ended for us because we are so spiritual. Okay, they're kind of thinking that we've reached this point, but they haven't. We're still here. We're still in this world, and we have to be realistic about living in this world and be careful about some kind of super spirituality that makes us think that somehow, oops, I hope that still works, that somehow this no longer matters at all. It matters for multiple reasons that will become clear. This matters. But this is why some people in the Corinthian church are saying, okay, maybe marriage is no longer for us. Maybe sex is no longer for us. And that's, of course, as I said before, that's a little bit of a problem if you're married. Okay? And your spouse suddenly says, oh, by the way, this is what I've decided about our sexual life. That's a problem. And it was a problem in Corinth. That's why they're writing the letter. So Paul says, stop depriving one another. Okay? If you're married, the norm is to have regular sexual relationships with one another and not to deprive one another. But then Paul is going to allow, this is his concession. He's going to say, okay, if you agree together, both of you agree, and for a limited time, okay, you can agree to abstain from sex, to focus on prayer. Okay, you can do your spiritual things. Okay, it's not wrong to do that. Okay, but it's potentially dangerous. So Paul says again, if you're going to abstain from sex in your married life, only by agreement. Both have to agree equally and only for a limited time. So Paul says, then come together again so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Paul says, this I say by way of concession, not a command. It's another important thing to keep in mind as you read 1 Corinthians 7. Okay, it's general principles and advice. Paul does not give a lot of commands that are absolute. He's forcing us to think about our situation and our circumstances and to make wise decisions, and it might be different from person to person. Your faces all look very serious. That's scaring me here. Are you uncomfortable with this particular topic? Okay, all right. I mean, it's there in 1 Corinthians 7, so we're dealing with it. But then Paul says, okay, I actually wish that all men were even as I myself am. That is single. At this point in his life, at least, Paul is single. It's unclear if at one point he was married. He might have been, as a strict Pharisaical Jewish person, it would have been expected he would be married. So maybe he was married at one time, but he's not now. So Paul says, actually, what I would prefer, what Paul's ideal is if everyone were single like he is. And again, the critical question is, why does Paul want that? But he says the reality is each man has his own gift from God, one in this manner, one in another. That is, some people, Paul calls it a gift. It's the same word he used for gifts, for spiritual gifts, like the gift of teaching and speaking in tongues. This is another gift. Some people call this the gift that no one wants. It's the gift for a person to be able to live their life without sex. It doesn't necessarily mean they've got no desire at all, but they're able to keep their sexual temptation under control so it doesn't become a temptation or a distraction. Okay, they are able to conduct their life in a fulfilling way without sex. Paul says that's a gift that God gives some people. Paul obviously has that gift, but Paul recognizes that not everyone has that gift. Okay, so each man has his own gift from God, one in this manner, one in another. I say to the unmarried and the widows that it's good for them to remain as I am. You know, ideally, he would like that. Once again, why? Why? But if they don't have that kind of self-control, if sexual temptation becomes such a distraction that they cannot function in life, then Paul is going to say it's better to get married. So let them marry. It's better to marry than to burn with passion, than to be so distracted by sex that you can't operate. It's better to be married and have normal sexual relationships. Okay? But this is one of those things that Paul says that has often been misunderstood in the church or misapplied in the church, and so there's been, ever since Paul's time, kind of this strain in church history that somehow thinks that marriage or sex are just not actually good things. Okay, that they are somehow inherently bad or harmful, and the ideal is to refrain from marriage and sex altogether, that you can actually attain some higher spiritual state by avoiding marriage and sex. But that is not what Paul is doing here. Paul is not anti-sex or anti-marriage. Okay? Sex is God's idea. He invented it, okay? It's God's idea. It's a good thing, and marriage is a good thing. Okay, it is not spiritually tainting. It is not a lower level of spirituality. Okay, Paul is not anti-sex or anti-marriage. He's pro-mission. Okay, the reason Paul is happy the way he is because he recognizes that he can live his life freely on God's mission. And for Paul, of course, that's just, he finds great joy and satisfaction in that. And he would be happy if other people could join him in that mission. That mission is so important to Paul that in his mind, this would be an ideal. So Paul's desire is for each believer to live a life as undistracted as possible from God's mission for them. Especially for Paul. Paul's desire is that we not be distracted from God's purpose for our life. But that's his goal. That's his desire, is a life that is undistracted by too many things here. We're all going to be distracted by some things. Okay, we all have to eat. Okay, so that takes time to eat. It takes time to prepare food. It takes time to wash dishes. You know, we have to wash our clothes. We have to go to the store. Some of you enjoy shopping. Others of us are like, We know exactly what we want. We enter the store. We hope we get the right size. We might not even take time to try them on. And but we all have to spend some time doing those kinds of things. We all have some distractions. Okay, Paul simply wants to minimize distractions so that we can have maximum focus on mission. This is what is driving Paul's words here. But he's not against marriage. Okay, as we'll talk about as we go on next week in the coming passages, most of the people around Paul are married. And he's got good married friends. When we looked at the book of Acts, there's, Aquila and Priscilla, who were business people, successful international business. Paul valued them. They were, I think, some of the most important people in the early church, and they were married. Paul is not anti-marriage. He's simply pro-mission. With that in mind, then, Paul talks very specifically about certain categories of people. So he says first, to the married, I give instructions. Not I, but the Lord. And here, what Paul means is Jesus himself actually directly addressed the question of marriage. When Jesus first talked about it, he was talking to Jewish people, married people who were Jewish, who were both within the people of God. Here in these verses, Paul is directing these comments to a married couple where both the husband and wife are Christians. Okay, so he's thinking about people in the church, both the husband and wife, and he's taking what Jesus said and he's applying it to them. Jesus says directly, a wife should not leave her husband. Okay, that is remain married because it's a command. This is what Jesus said. Okay, so there are some commands. Not everything in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 is advice. Some of it is a command. And here's one. If you're married, remain married. But even then, Paul is realistic. If a wife does leave, okay, that can happen for any number of reasons. But if that happens, then she must remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. Same way with the husband. Husband should not divorce his wife. Okay? All through chapter 7, the general principle is remain in whatever situation you are in when God called you. If you're married and your spouse is a Christian, remain married. Apart from any other consideration, remain married because Jesus already gave his command about that. Then the other category is something that Jesus did not directly address, but it would have been very common in the early church, and that is a married couple where one person becomes a Christian but the other doesn't. Okay, and I imagine the Corinthian church was full of people in this category where someone became a Christian but their husband or their wife was not a believer. And here especially, this is where some of the Corinthians are maybe thinking, well, surely now we have to end our marriage. I'm a Christian. My husband or wife is not a Christian. They're going to corrupt me because they're not a Christian. They're unclean. Okay, and so I can't remain married to a non-Christian. I can't continue to have sexual relationships with a non-Christian because I'm a Christian. I belong to this new realm. My spouse is down here, and so that surely I need to end my marriage, is what they were thinking. And Paul says, not so fast. But to the rest, I say, not the Lord, that is, again, Jesus didn't talk directly about this situation. If any brother has a wife who's an unbeliever and she consents to live with him, he must not divorce her. And if a woman has an unbelieving husband and he consents to live with her, she must not send her husband away. Even if your spouse is not a Christian, your default setting is remain married. Why? Because the unbelieving husband is sanctified through his wife. And the unbelieving wife is sanctified through her believing husband. Rather than the uncleanness passing to the Christian, Paul is saying, actually, there might be an influence that goes the other way. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, and maybe some in this category are afraid of that. You know, my husband or my wife is not a Christian, and we have kids, and you know, our home is not really a Christian home, and are my kids unclean now? I mean, that's a fear that some of them are having, but Paul says, no, they are actually holy. They're actually holy. If the unbelieving one leaves, okay, if the unbeliever makes a choice to end the marriage, which no doubt happened, then let them leave. The brother or sister isn't in bondage in such cases. You're not required in that case to kind of fight to maintain the marriage if the non-believing spouse wants to leave it. But, and the word but is important here, but God has actually called us to peace. What does Paul mean by that? Some people think all Paul is saying is, you know, you want to keep things peaceful, so if the non-believer wants to leave, don't have a fight, just keep the peace, let them go. It's probably not actually what Paul is saying here. He's saying, you know, you're not under bondage, but better is that God has called us to bring peace, to bring shalom, okay? To actually try to be an influence on that unbelieving one, to bring about not just peace in the relationship, but to bring that person to reconciliation with God. Remain in your marriage, okay? Because you're the best person to win your spouse. For how do you know, wife, if you save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you'll save your wife? You might. You can't be certain. You can't make your spouse become a Christian. Okay, I mean, you can't nag someone into the heaven. Okay, you have to be wise about it, but there's a chance that your spouse who is unbelieving right now might become a believer. There's a chance. So remain in your marriage if you can to bring that about. Paul uses these words 3 times in the English Bible, translated as sanctified or holy, but they come from the same Greek root. In this case, the unbelieving husband is sanctified, or the unbelieving wife is sanctified, or children actually become holy. Once again, what does that mean? Does that mean they are automatically become Christians? Probably not. I mean, Paul certainly believes that faith is necessary. Okay, someone doesn't automatically go to heaven just because their spouse is a Christian. Okay? So what does it mean to be sanctified or to be holy? It's an important word in the Bible, and I want to spend a couple minutes talking about it because it will help us to make a lot of other decisions. You know, for instance, some in our body are, going off to run in the marathon. Are we more holy than they are because we're in church? Are they less holy because they are, running in a race? Some people would say that. On church, on Sunday, you're in church. You've always got to be in church. That's the holy place to be. The root idea of the word holy is to be set apart. Okay, so God is holy in the sense that he is different. He is set apart. He's set apart from anything. God is absolutely holy because there's no one else in that category. Okay, there's one God, and he is holy. He is completely different than all other gods, and in that sense, God is holy. He is completely different and set apart from anything else. Nothing is like God. But when we think about what it means for us to be holy, the way the word is used in the Bible, it can have different things it focuses on or a different emphasis. Okay, so sometimes the word holy can refer to being set apart to God. Okay, and it emphasizes that vertical relationship. We're set apart to God, so we need to focus on God. You go to church on Sunday so you can focus on God. Sunday morning is about your focus on God because we want to be holy. We want to be set apart to God. So sometimes, the word holy is talking about, our relationship with God, being set apart to God. But that's not the only emphasis to the word holy in the Bible. Other times, the emphasis is more on set apart from something, set apart from the world. Of course, it's related to being set apart to God. If you're set apart to God, then you're going to be set apart from other things, but sometimes the emphasis is here. In 1 Thessalonians, Paul used the word holy, and he uses it in reference to people's sexual lives. You need to be holy in your sexual life. You need to be set apart from the way the world uses sex. Okay, but holiness is not only about sex. But there's another way in which the word holy can be used. The emphasis is on being set apart for a purpose. Set apart for a purpose. Of course, it's related to being set apart to God because it's God's purpose, but if you're set apart to God, then you're going to be set apart to God's purpose. And we are holy when we are living out God's purposes for us. This is how objects can be holy. In the temple, the objects were holy. The bowls were holy. The candlesticks were holy. In what sense were they holy? Would they suddenly become magical? No. Did their molecular, structure change? No. They were holy simply in the sense they were set apart for a particular purpose. They were used only in the temple, not for anything else. Okay, they're set apart for a purpose. In 1 Corinthians 7, when Paul talks about being sanctified or holy, this is what he's focusing on. Their marriages can become holy if they use their marriage for a purpose. Their children are holy in the sense that they're children because there's at least one Christian in the house. Their children are in this setting where Christ is. Okay, the believer brings Christ into that home and makes that home holy so that the unbelievers in that home have a chance to experience Christ. It's about purpose. They are to live their lives set apart for purpose. This is what Paul is getting about in marriage and in singleness. Whatever choices we make about being married, about being single, the critical question is, what is my purpose? And how does my choice affect my purpose? Okay. The reason I think it's okay that some people in our body are, running in the Riga Marathon is because they have a chance to be salt and light. I mean, it's a big thing. A lot of people enjoy it. There's a lot of people down there, and people run with their colleagues or friends. And they have a chance to do something on purpose. It's Sunday morning. Okay. It'd be nice to have everyone here on Sunday morning. I like it when there's more people. I don't like especially these empty seats. I hate these empty seats. Okay. But church is not about what happens in these walls. This is not the only holy space. Okay? Holiness is also what can happen down there as people in our church take Christ there. A few years ago, some of you might remember, we had a Canadian hockey player who was here in town, and he was playing for I don't know if it was Riga Dynamo or whatever. He also ended up playing on the Canadian Olympic team that won the bronze medal. So a bunch of us got, pictures with the bronze medalist. But he had practice on Sunday morning, so he could rarely come to services on Sunday. And I know more than one pastor who would say, oh, well, you got to quit hockey. You got to be on church at Sunday service, so you got to quit hockey. The holy thing to do is to quit hockey and to come to church on Sunday morning. Okay. I mean, honestly, here at Communitas, we take a very different view of that. He's a missionary to hockey players. No one else can reach those hockey players like he can. Okay, God made him good at hockey. He needs to take that seriously. And he needs to stay in that world to be salt and light. He is holy by playing hockey on Sunday morning. Okay, because he can live out his purpose, and he helps us live out our purpose. The purpose of Communitas is fulfilled as we help you go out there and live your life on purpose out there. The primary purpose of Communitas is not to have a perfect Sunday morning service. I would love to have a perfect Sunday morning service. I would like to make everything, everything that we do revolve around Sunday morning. But that's not actually holy, because God has a purpose for his people out in the world. Well, that's what Paul is doing in 1 Corinthians 7. What does this have to do with us, and how can we apply this in other ways? And back to this picture. 1 Corinthians 7 is one of the most amazing pieces of literature ever, I think. Paul is such a perfect pastor in 1 Corinthians 7. It's so wise and realistic. And it's so easy to go to one extreme or another. And for 2,000 years of church history, Christians have gone to one extreme and sometimes fall off the cliff one way or fall off the cliff another way. And Paul is navigating this difficult road of living in both of these worlds at once. It's easy to say, just forget about this one, and we're all going to do religious activities. That's easy to do and convenient, and we don't have to make any more decisions. When the pastor says, come to the church building, you come to the church building. I don't even have to make any decisions anymore. That's an easy extreme. Paul doesn't do that. Okay, he's maintaining this balance between these two worlds, where we're citizens of heaven, but living missionally here on earth. He doesn't give a lot of rules. It's always got to be this way. He can't give rules because each of you has a little bit different life and different gifts and different circumstances. And if the Bible were a rule book for all our decisions, it would be huge. It'd be huge just for you, and another huge book for the next person. It's not the kind of book the Bible is, and that's not what Paul was trying to do, to give some kind of rule for every situation. We have to think. We have to be with Jesus. We've got to listen to the Holy Spirit. We have to stay engaged in the world. We've got to walk that balance of being in both of these worlds and making a difference in this world. Because we're in this world. If God didn't want us here, we wouldn't be here. Does that make sense? If God wanted us in heaven right now, we'd be in heaven right now. We're not. We're here. Okay? Because God has a purpose for us. And our holiness will be seen as we live out our purpose in the world. So that's kind of one general principle, that goes beyond just the marriage and singleness question. That we have to think and learn to live our lives in both of these worlds. To go to church, but to be a good student. To have Christian friends, but have non-Christian friends. Okay. To do some church things, because, there's some church things needs to be done, but to go to parties, maybe. And go to sports events, and to be involved, to be engaged, to make a difference. Okay, to be holy in your setting. And And then finally, one last principle. I know this has been kind of long here. This goes back especially, as we think about questions of marriage and singleness, questions that you make about your career, about, where you end up living. Some of you are here as students, some of you might stay, some of you probably in a few years will go back to your home country or go to another country, and you're going to have to make critical decisions, and how are you going to make that decision? All through 1 Corinthians, Paul has emphasized the place of the cross of Jesus. And the cross of Jesus is our example, is our model. If you remember back when we looked at Galatians, Paul said, "I never boast about anything except the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ. Because of that cross, my interest in this world has been crucified, and the world's interest in me has also died." For many people, that question of marriage and singleness is one of the fundamental questions. I mean, it is a critical decision, and it's easy to make that kind of decision about getting married, who to get married to, based on any number of things. My guess is if you're not married, your parents have some suggestions for you about marriage. Okay, are you going to get married? When are you going to get married? I want grandchildren. And parents put pressure on you, and society puts pressure on you, and your body puts pressure on you. And those things are pulling and pushing on you, and there's nothing wrong, with having desires one way or another. But one of the things the cross of Christ does for us is that it's meant to kill all those other interests. And whatever choice you might end up needing to make, it might feel like a cross. It might feel like a sacrifice. But it all has to go on the cross. Everything the world has to say about marriage and sex and singleness, it's all got to go on the cross. It's got to be crucified. It's got to be killed. It's got to be buried. And maybe God will bring it to life again. But maybe not. Okay. Your desires for marriage, you might have to nail to the cross. And your desire for sex, you might have to nail to the cross. And it might be dead and have to be dead for the rest of your life. And that's a sacrifice. And it is a sacrifice. But it's the cross of Jesus. Or you might be in a marriage that is difficult, and there might be an easy escape. But for some people, the cross is, I'm going to stay in this marriage. I'd rather get out of this marriage, but I'm going to stay in this marriage. For some of you, your cross is to go back where you came from. Maybe you'd rather stay in Latvia. I don't blame you. I want you to stay in Latvia. I really do. My will for you is to stay in Latvia. Okay? I have to put that on the cross. Okay? But maybe God wants you to go back to your home, and you don't want to. Maybe there's not much money to be made in your home. You might have to put that on the cross. The cross determines everything. Okay, and our interest in the world and the world's interest in us, all of it has to go on the cross. It has to be killed. Like I said, often God will will raise it to life, and we'll end up with something far more amazing than we could have willed. But first, it's got to go on the cross. When it's on the cross, then new life comes, and we experience Jesus in a new way, and we live a life that makes a difference, that in the end will be satisfying. It's hard. It is a sacrifice. Jesus did it. Jesus did it. Lord, I'm not sure in all the words that I've said that what makes sense or what hit home or what it is that each person here needs to keep in front of them and to think about, but I pray that your Spirit would bring to our minds what's most important and help us, Lord, to make wise and holy decisions based on your good purposes for us. Amen. All right, the band is coming up for one more song.
my joy, my righteousness, and my all. You're the best. You're my joy, my righteousness. You're my all. You're the best. You're my joy, my righteousness, and I love you, Lord. Knowing you, Jesus. Knowing you, there is no greater thing. You're my all, you're the best. You're my joy, my righteousness, and I love you, Lord.
Thanks for being here. Sorry for a little bit longer service than normal. Thanks for your patience. It's a great day outside. Go out, enjoy the weather, meet people, watch the runners, support some of your church people. But God bless you this week.